A couple is torn apart by racist parents, but later those parents beg forgiveness when they need support. In the modest riverside borough of Northmere, the willow by the old ferry landing had a reputation for listening. It leaned toward secrets and stooped toward murmurs from the water, collecting confessions in the pockets of its bark. Nia Moreland and Cale Arden learned to trust it the way sailors trust stars. She came from the white-pillared side of Northmere, where lawns behaved like carpets and dinner forks multiplied in confusing hierarchies. He rented a small room over a bakery that woke the dawn with cinnamon. They met in fragments. A lost scarf that the wind hurled into his path, a smile traded over a queue for bus tokens, a shared umbrella that bowed under autumn rain. In the hush under the willow, their differences dissolved. Nia spoke of painting skies wider than any Northmere horizon. Cale spoke of medicine, of stitching broken bodies with patience and gentleness. The willow drank their vows and sighed. But while the tree approved, the town tuned its ears like a hunting dog. If the river listened without judgment, the streets did the opposite, rehearsing small cruelties the way choirs rehearse hymns. The lovers sensed it approaching, not a thunderclap, but a fine, abrasive sand that would soon scour them raw. Nia's parents, Dominic and Marjorie Moreland, ran their household like a museum. Cool lights, polished heirlooms, silence unless curated otherwise. Dominic sat on local boards, shaped zoning debates, and had an opinion on every neighboring roofline. Marjorie donated to galas where charity was a chandelier. They were not monsters in the ordinary sense. They smiled at the baker, greeted the letter carrier, and never parked across a stranger's driveway. But their courtesy had boundaries that mirrored their beliefs, a lattice of people like us and people like them. When Nia's late-night giggles began slipping through vents, when sketches of two figures, one brown, one ivory, appeared in her studio, her mother's lips folded as neatly as napkins, and her father's newspaper crackled like dry leaves. They summoned Nia to the conservatory, where plants were arranged by cost rather than sunlight. The conversation wore gloves. "We are only considering your future," Dominic said, aligning two coasters that were already aligned. "You are vulnerable to illusions," Marjorie added, a phrase she used about fragrances and friends she disliked. Nia's heart pounded a truth she could no longer hide. She named Cale. The plant seemed to flinch. Dominic's smile didn't falter, but its temperature dropped. "Invite him to dinner," he said. "Let us all be reasonable." The invitation promised civility, and for the first 5 minutes, it delivered. Cale arrived in a pressed shirt and borrowed tie, holding a modest bouquet he'd bought with careful coins. Nia steadied his hand at the door. There was soup infused with fennel, a roast jeweled with rosemary, and wine with a history longer than most marriages. But generosity at that table was a performance, and everyone knew the script. "Tell us about your work," Dominic began, as if a cross-examination had simply picked up from a recess. Cale answered calmly about clinical rotation, about night shifts that taught him what grief smelled like at 4 a.m. Marjorie's smile was delicate as spun sugar and just as brittle. "How ambitious," she said, which sounded almost like how presumptuous. A parade of questions followed, about Cale's family background, his neighborhood influences, whether he'd considered how demanding careers can strain relationships. Each query wore silk stockings over steel springs. Nia squeezed Cale's knee under the table and felt tension shiver through him. When Dominic finally asked, "Do you think our daughter is prepared for the life that comes with you?" the question was a key that opened a door to a cold, echoing room. Cale set down his fork and met the man's eyes. "Do you think anyone is prepared for the life that comes with you?" he replied, softly, but the softness was an edge. Dominic's response was practiced elegance. He thanked Cale for coming, offered the rest of the roast to take for your friends, and arranged a ride home Nia couldn't intercept. When the door shut, the performance ended. Marjorie's voice, sweetened for guests, turned sharp as vinegar. "You are naive," she told Nia, which is fortunate because it can be cured. Dominic's version of care involved graphs, graduation rates, home values by district, a chart of crime he'd cherry-picked. He spoke about probabilities as if love were a casino. "If you continue," he said, "you will find the world does not bend to your optimism." He promised to tighten her accounts, stall her gallery showcase, and steer you out of harm's way. He called it steering. Nia called it a cage. She waited until their footsteps retreated and the grandfather clock began its smug counting. Then she packed a bag. A sweater that remembered his shoulder, a tin of watercolor pans, a toothbrush wrapped in a scarf. She wrote a note that trembled toward the truth. I choose us. Meet me by the willow at midnight, and we will be bigger than their fear. Outside, the river inhaled. Thunder rolled its shoulders. The night suggested both promise and consequence. Storms in Northmere are not dramatic in the theatrical sense. They are persistent. 1,000 small needles of rain instead of a single spear of lightning. Nia ran beneath them anyway, the bag thumping her hip, her breaths flashing in the lamplight. The willow loomed like a dark cathedral. She saw Kale's outline at the railing, hair plastered, posture tense. He turned the instant she did, relief flaring across his face like a match, and then headlights carved the night. The Moreland sedan slid to a halt, authority in chrome. Dominic and Marjorie emerged under a shared umbrella that remembered swans. Words collided. Pleas, accusations, oaths. Nia reached for Kale. Dominic's hand pulled her back with a grip that had never changed a diaper or shouldered a coffin. A shout. A slip, a sickening scrape of shoe on wet metal. Kale lurched, caught the railing, and then the current seized the moment. He vanished too fast for anyone to be noble. The river swallowed sound. Someone screamed, Naya or the wind, she never knew. The search crews came, and the willow watched, and a shoe was found downstream. Moreland connections ensured efficient reports with tidy conclusions. The water was fierce, the night unkind. Accidents happen. There was nothing you could have done, Marjorie whispered, a lullaby with a locked door behind it. Grief settled on Nia like a damp coat she could never remove. There are griefs that howl, and there are griefs that hum so steadily you forget what silence feels like. Nia's grief hummed. Under parental choreography, she married a man named Pierce Ashbury, whose handshake could negotiate a treaty and whose compliments arrived like invoices, itemized and due upon receipt. He admired Nia's beauty as an asset and her gentleness as a resource. Their home contained tasteful art that made no arguments. 2 children arrived, sweet, bewildering miracles who taught Nia that love expands like bread in an oven, even when flour is rationed. She painted at night, abstract skies that looked like bruises healing. The willow visits ceased, then become legends told to herself in whispers. Northmere applauded the picture, a Moreland daughter restored to the right frame, a family portrait signed by propriety. Yet, in the grocery aisle or at red lights, Nia felt the ghost of river spray on her cheeks. The calendar shed years like leaves, and the numbness changed shape, from ice to glass. Glass lets you see life. It also shatters. Pierce mistook her quiet for contentment. Dominic and Marjorie mistook it for victory. Only the children sensed a missing note in the song of their home. They asked once, "Why does Mommy's smile look tired?" Pierce answered with a gift, Dominic with a donation, Marjorie with a new set of china. None of it sounded like music. Hospitals are cities that never sleep, governed by alarms and coffee. When Northmere General expanded, it announced the arrival of a new attending in trauma surgery, Dr. C. Arden. The initial meant little to anyone except a person who had once watched a river erase a future. Nia was at the hospital with her daughter's sprained wrist when she passed a corridor where a familiar voice recalibrated chaos. Low, steady, decisive as a metronome. She froze, saw the profile, felt blood find new roots under her skin. Kale was not a story that ended by water. He was here, older at the edges, eyes carrying more winter but still carved for kindness. For a long minute, she watched him speak to a nurse, to a frightened parent, to a patient whose tears he understood without translation. When he turned, when recognition hit and stopped just short of crashing, Nia thought all the clocks in Northmere forgot their jobs. "You," she managed. "You were the river," he said, and the past knocked at the present's door. Their first conversation was the opposite of their last by the willow. Halting, astonished, wrapped in institutional beige. He had been found downstream by anglers, unconscious, sparing with oxygen. He'd left Northmere without looking back, the pain a compass pointing anywhere else. "I thought you stopped waiting," he said. "I thought you stopped breathing," she answered. Rumors in Northmere travel faster than ambulances. Staff saw glances stretch into conversations. Volunteers noted how a woman in a thrifted denim jacket, too humble for a Moreland daughter, lingered near the trauma wing. Nia tried to conduct her days like always, but routine instruments began playing wrong notes. Pierce sensed it the way foxes sense weather. Dominic caught wind from a club acquaintance who used whispers like currency. "He's back," the man said cheerfully, as if announcing a festival. Marjorie's fingers tightened around a porcelain teacup she had never washed. Nia and Kale, meanwhile, stumbled through a terrain mapped by longing and hurt. They spoke on park benches, not near the willow. They shared updates about years that had grown without each other, his residency battles, her children's favorite bedtime songs, the way grief had worn grooves into both of them. He apologized for leaving without sending word. She apologized for not finding a way to tear the world open and follow him. The apologies did not cancel each other. They made space for breath. Kale did not ask her to choose. Nia did not promise what she could not yet deliver, but their hearts rehearsed quietly for a courage that would soon be required in public, not under trees. Pierce approached the issue like a negotiation. Identify the leverage, neutralize the threat, preserve the brand. You're restless, he told Nia, and restlessness can be managed. He offered a vacation, a new studio, a separate wing in the house where she could pretend freedom. Nia said she wanted honesty. Pierce said honesty must be managed too. She had loved him in the way one loves a safe harbor after surviving a storm, gratefully, but always watching the horizon. He was not cruel, not unfaithful, not villainous. He was simply calibrated for control, and Nia had outgrown control. When she finally said Kale's name aloud at their dining table, Pierce blinked as if the lighting had changed. "You are confused," he said, which was civilized code for "you are betraying the arrangement." The argument slalomed around the children's bedtime and collided with the front door. Dominic arrived uninvited, with Marjorie in a shade of lavender that photographed well. They spoke of caution, reputation, and lessons painfully learned. Nia's spine learned a new word. "No, you taught me fear," she told her parents. "You taught me to accept cages with velvet lining. I'm not cold anymore." Marjorie called her ungrateful. Dominic called her reckless. Nia called herself awake. Disasters, like revelations, do not schedule themselves. The flood began with rain that wasn't exceptional until it refused to stop. Northmere's levees were old, its confidence new, and water respects neither. The river shrugged its banks and slithered into streets. Northmere General shifted into siege mode. Kale didn't sleep for 32 hours, directing triage, reminding exhausted staff to drink water, resetting a bone with hands that remembered Nia's wrist. Nia volunteered in the art therapy room turned shelter, calming frightened children with crayons, translating fear into color. Dominic called from the Moreland house perched on its neat hill. Certain elevation guaranteed exemption. Marjorie complained that sandbags were unsightly. By dusk, the water made its own invitations. The Moreland house groaned as if remembering that hills are only taller ground, not proof of virtue. A chandelier surrendered. Marjorie slipped on marble. Dominic's heart, a longtime exhibitionist at checkups, decided to audition for calamity. They were evacuated on a raft that smelled like rubber bands and humility. In the gym where cots assembled a democracy of discomfort, Marjorie looked around as if the universe had changed restaurants without asking her preference. Dominic clutched his chest, breath skipping. A volunteer pointed to the triage sign. "Trauma," she said. "Ask for Dr. Arden. He doesn't miss." The first time Dominic Moreland looked small was under fluorescent bulbs that bleached everyone to the same color. Tired, Marjorie hovered, her elegance cut down to essentials. A sweater, a bare face, a tremor she could not accessorize away. When she saw Nia, she startled like a deer, pride fumbling for a mask that the flood had washed downstream. "Please," she said, a word that had rarely crossed her tongue. "Your friend, the doctor, we need him." Something shifted in Nia. Not a triumph, not a payback, but a quiet dawning of complexity. She nodded. Kale arrived, expression clinical, voice steady. "Describe the pain," he instructed Dominic, who complied without the add-on commentary he usually gave professionals he considered in service. Tests were ordered. A tacky rhythm sketched its jagged graffiti across the monitor. "We'll stabilize him," Kale said. Marjorie's gratitude was awkward, like learning an unfamiliar dance. A grasping of hands, a thank you that skidded toward apology and stopped. In the corridor, alone for a minute that stretched, she turned to Nia. "We were wrong," Marjorie admitted, the words breaking skin on their way out. "We were afraid of losing you. We did not see that we were ensuring it." Nia listened, the past winding its tapes. Forgiveness did not leap. It took a breath. Dominic's condition required a procedure that mapped arteries like old roads, with detours and caution signs. Kale stood at the head of the surgical team, all human history trimmed to a field of view and a problem to solve. Outside, on a vinyl chair that punished contemplation, Nia sat between her children, who had never seen their grandfather humbled and didn't know how to hold the sight. Pierce arrived, drawn by the gravity of catastrophe. He greeted Cale with the polite coldness men reserve for rivals, then moved to comfort Nia with a hand she could no longer accept as refuge. Marjorie, face ash gray without its usual orchestra of products, clutched a rosary she'd found among donations. Not for faith, but for counting. She spoke quiet, almost to herself. "My grandmother taught me who to fear," she confessed. "I thought I was being careful, like she was careful. Care can be cruelty when it wears a disguise." Nia felt the weight of those inherited instructions, a lineage of warnings shaped by cowardice and respectability. In that hallway, ancestry and anesthesia mingled, old blood narratives cut with new promises to be braver. The monitor ticked, the river pressed against the building, a muscle flexing. Inside the operating room, Cale's hands built a bridge. No Willow needed this time, just exactness and resolve. Surgery is a grammar of decisions. Cale read the sentence of Dominic's heart and revised it one careful clause at a time. A complication threw punctuation into chaos, a hidden calcification, a split-second judgment. He took it, eyes narrowing, team following his cadence like a jazz combo hitting an impossible run. Hours later, he emerged, shoulders slumping without collapsing. "He's stable," Cale reported. Marjorie's breath escaped in a sob that rediscovered its voice half a century late. "Thank you," she said again, and this time the words bent toward the floor like a bow. Cale nodded, and after a pause added, "Recovery will be work." He could have walked away then, left the hallway heavy with what-ifs. Instead, he stayed, listening as Marjorie said the thing she had never said. "I hurt you. I hurt my daughter. I believed a lie that power told me, that I was protecting us by drawing lines around love. If you cannot forgive me, I will still say it. I was wrong." Cale didn't absolve her with a flourish. He said, "I hear you." In those 3 words was a gentleness that had refused to die in the river. Nia took his hand, not because a decision was suddenly easy, but because truth had finally earned a chair at the table. Flood cleanup works like grief. First, triage, then long labor. Northmere learned humility with mops. The Moorland house, once a sermon on elevation, now smelled like damp wood and realism. Dominic, pale but louder each day, returned to a bedroom that had traded silk drapes for tarps. Marjorie became an apprentice in ordinary life. Laundry, grocery lists, apologies that didn't use flowers as surrogates. She asked Nia to sit with her on the back steps one evening. The garden was a study in silt. "I raised you to be admired," Marjorie said, "because I thought being admired would keep you safe. I forgot to raise you to be free." Nia's eyes filled in a way that didn't sting. "I wanted both," she said. "I still do." Later, when Cale visited to check Dominic's incision and insist he follow instructions, Dominic met him not as a commodity, but as a man who had held his life. "I was cruel," Dominic admitted, blunt where he had once been barbed in velvet. "If your forgiveness takes the rest of my days to earn, that will be a decent project for me." Cale nodded, but he did not transfer responsibility to absolution like a deed to property. He talked instead about cardiac rehab and the tyranny of salt, and in that practical kindness, something sturdier than sentiment took root. Pierce asked for a meeting at a cafe that smelled like almond paste and endings. He arrived with measured compassion, not performative fury. "I wanted to be the answer to a question you never got to finish asking," he said. "Perhaps I mistook comfort for love." Nia appreciated the clarity more than she could say. "You gave our children a steady roof," she replied, "but the sky above me was borrowed." They spoke, not as litigants, but as parents who refused to use their children as furniture to be divided. They decided on separate households, shared holidays, and a promise to show the kids that endings can be orderly and still honest. For once, Dominic did not try to reframe the narrative. Marjorie did not edit the tears out of it. Cale did not appear as a trophy or a prize because he wasn't one. He was a person Nia had loved through death and resurrection, through rumor and refusal. When she told him about the separation, he listened without reaching for celebration. "Choose me because it is the right thing for your soul," he said, "not to correct an old wound." Nia answered, "I am choosing me, and I hope that path runs beside you." Months later, Nia opened a small gallery in a building that used to sell thread. Her first show was called High Water Marks. The canvases were not polite. Turbulent blues clawed at smug golds. Bridges arced over chasms that glowed like sternums seen through skin. The town came because towns do, hungry for spectacle, braced for confession. Pierce brought the children and bragged about their mother's courage. Marjorie stood near a painting that looked like guilt dissolving and practiced the art of not narrating her daughter. Dominic leaned on a cane, having finally learned what it means to need help. Cale arrived late, hands still smelling faintly of antiseptic, tie loosened. He looked at each painting as if it were a patient, searching for the pulse. When he reached the last canvas, a river pooling under a willow that did not drown but bent, sheltering, he closed his eyes. Nia stepped beside him. "You survived," she said. "So did you," he replied. People approached them with congratulations, with questions about process, with apologies disguised as compliments. Northmere was learning to be better in increments. Not everyone succeeded, but some did, and the room felt rare for it, a place where shame had not been invited to curtsy, but to confess and then help put away chairs. Just as Dominic embraced the disciplines of rehab and restraint, Marjorie's body filed its own petition, a diagnosis that required a donor with a tricky antigen match. The list was long and indifferent. The odds were arithmetic, not poetry. The children were tested. Naya was tested. Cousins and cousins' pricked and waited. Cale coordinated from a professional distance that still trembled with history. Weeks folded into each other. Marjorie learned the taste of dread and the humility of dependence. One afternoon, Cale knocked on the moorland door with the expression of a man carrying both news and a mirror. "We found a match," he said, voice steadying itself. "It's me." Silence stretched. The river outside seemed to listen. Dominic's mouth formed a protest that had no words behind it. Marjorie sat very still. A queen deposed and offered a crown she did not deserve. "I cannot ask you," she whispered. Cale shook his head. "You aren't. I am offering." "I am." He explained the risks, the logistics, the boring heroism of hospital forms. He did not swear that this would balance scales. He did not turn grace into spectacle. He simply presented a choice: to let the past end a life or allow the present to amend it. Marjorie cried in a way that moisturizers cannot fix. Donations of the body are bargains with uncertainty. Cale's colleagues, some of whom knew his history, asked careful questions whose subtext he understood. "Are you sure?" He was. Nia tried to argue that he shouldn't have to. Cale replied that "have to" and "choose to" are different verbs, and this was the second. The day of the procedure, the hospital seemed to hold its breath. Pierce brought the children to wait with Dominic, who paced the corridor in a loop that spelled out his penance. The operation went according to the numbers, which for once felt like mercy. When Marjorie woke, she found Nia's hand and then searched for Cale. He slept under hospital-issue blankets, pallor matching the sheets, body newly missing a part that would help hers keep going. Marjorie whispered to the ceiling as if God were hiding in the vents. "I do not deserve this," she said, "but I promise to deserve the years it buys me." In recovery, Cale deflected thanks with humor, which landed gently, leaving dents instead of bruises. "No more chandeliers near marble floors," he told Marjorie. "No more diets that are actually punishments," he advised Dominic. To Nia, privately, he offered nothing performative, just a hand that had cut grief away from arteries and still wanted to hold hers. Northmere's calendar returned to potlucks and parades, but it remembered how quickly water can erase certainties. The town council passed measures that sounded like repentance dressed in municipal prose. Dominic advocated for them with a ferocity he once reserved for real estate setbacks. He called Cale his doctor with a reverence unmarred by ownership. Marjorie volunteered at the clinic, sorting donations with the zeal of someone who had once outsourced empathy and now insisted on doing it herself. She apologized in small installments to neighbors she'd ignored, to the baker whose accent she had imitated in college while friends laughed, to the river she had treated like scenery instead of geography. Nia and Cale did not rush marriage or declarations meant for announcements. They built a home in a street that floods less often, with shelves low enough for children's hands and windows wide enough for the future to see in. Pierce remarried a teacher who loved his spreadsheets and taught him the beauty of mess. The children learned that families change shape and still fit, and the willow, older now, still listening, watched them all. When storms came, as storms do, Northmere stacked sandbags without first checking surnames. It is not a miracle, but it is something that keeps feet dry and hearts warmer. Forgiveness, Nia learned, is less a door than a practice of leaving it ajar. There were days when old rage wandered in, dripping river water, and needed a towel. On those days, she painted longer. Cale learned that healing people he loved carried a different weight in his hands than healing strangers. He took up running at dawn, the quiet road a place to set weight down. Dominic remained a man who liked influence, but now he measured it by how often he used it for those he had once excluded. Marjorie kept a journal where she did not censor the past, but annotated it with fierce truth. At family dinners, jokes outnumbered speeches. At anniversaries of the flood, candles flickered on the ferry landing, and the willow swayed as if in applause. When Nia and Cale finally married, in a small ceremony that forgot to be perfect, the vows sounded like adults keeping promises children had once whispered under leaves. They did not erase history. They wrote a new chapter in the same book. At the end of the night, after the dancing and the laughter and the gentle arguments over who got to carry leftover cake, Nia looked toward the camera and, with a smile that no longer looked tired, said, "If this story traveled with you, if you want more tales where love wrestles fear and wins by choosing again and again, subscribe, stay with us, and let's keep listening under the willow."